6 months after my father's funeral. A code violation letter waits on my porch. Illegal structure on HOA property, it says. My hands are shaking, but my voice isn't. Neighbors whisper. Something feels wrong here. I smile and say, check the deed first. Across the street, a woman in white linen stops smiling, because she knows exactly what's buried in that basement. I'm Callie Reyes, 34, back in Millbrook Ridge, Georgia, to settle my late father's estate, the same quiet 14 acres my grandfather farmed before the subdivision ever existed. I never planned to stay long. I never planned to fight anyone. I work remotely as a structural engineer, which means numbers don't lie to me and neither do property lines. My father left me the old farmhouse, a stubborn oak tree, and a strip of undeveloped land the county still listed under our family's name. The first week back, I noticed the changes. Where cow pasture used to roll toward the highway, 12 gleaming buildings now stood. A strip mall, a self-storage complex, a dental office, a bank branch with a drive-through window painted the same beige as everything else. Cedar Hollow Commons. The sign read, a Cedar Hollow Estates HOA development. I hadn't approved any of it. I hadn't even been asked. My father, sick for 2 years before he passed, apparently hadn't either. At the mailbox, my neighbor Denise filled me in with the tone of someone delivering gossip and warning in the same breath. That's all Regina Voss is doing. She runs this HOA like her own kingdom. Nobody crosses her. Regina Voss, HOA president for 11 years running, drove a white Escalade with a vanity plate reading QENRV. She'd built the commercial strip herself. Denise said, for the community's benefit, charging tenants premium rent no one in Millbrook Ridge had ever seen before. I told myself it wasn't my problem. I had estate paperwork to file, a house to clean out, grief to process quietly. But something about those 12 buildings sitting on land shaped exactly like my grandfather's back 40 kept nagging at the engineer in my brain. I pulled up the county GIS map that night. The parcel lines for Cedar Hollow Commons overlapped, almost perfectly, with the undeveloped acreage still deeded under Reyes Family Trust. Not close. Overlapped. I told myself surveys get redrawn all the time. Boundaries shift on paper even when the ground never moves. I decided to mention it, politely, at the next HOA meeting. Just a question. I had no idea what I was about to walk into. The Cedar Hollow clubhouse smelled like fresh paint and ambition. Regina Voss sat at the head table like a queen holding court, gavel in hand, 3 board members flanking her like nervous courtiers who'd learned long ago not to disagree. New business, she announced, scanning the room until her eyes landed on me. Ah, Reyes. I hope you're settling into the neighborhood rules smoothly. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It never would. I'd learn. I raised my hand anyway. I had a question about the commercial parcel behind my property. The county map shows some overlap with land still under my family's trust. Could someone walk me through the survey history? The room went quiet in that specific way rooms go quiet when everyone already knows the answer and is waiting to see who says it first. Regina's smile didn't waver, but her knuckles whitened around the gavel. That parcel was surveyed and replatted years ago, she said smoothly. Before your father's time, even. I'd hate for you to waste your energy chasing paperwork ghosts when you've got a house to settle. Grief makes people see problems that aren't there. It was a small comment, almost kind on its surface, but it landed like a warning. A woman 2 rows back caught my eye and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Don't push this here," it said. I filed that look away for later. I let it go that night, mostly because I was tired and the drive home was dark and I had boxes of my father's belongings waiting to be sorted. But I printed the GIS overlay anyway and tucked it into a folder labeled, simply, "Look into this." 3 days later, a certified letter arrived. Not about the commercial parcel, about my fence. Unauthorized structure violating HOA setback guidelines. It read, with a fine of $200 a day until removed. My grandfather built that fence in 1974. I called the HOA office, and the woman who answered sounded apologetic but firm. "Mrs. L. personally," she said. "She says the fence encroaches on a shared easement." I asked which easement. She said she'd have to check and call me back. She never did. I drove past Cedar Hollow Commons the next morning with new eyes. Engineer's eyes. Measuring sight lines and setbacks against what I remembered from childhood summers on that land. The rear loading dock of the self-storage building sat almost exactly where our old barn used to stand. An older man restocking vending machines at the storage facility waved when he saw me parked at the fence line. "You're Tom Reyes's girl, aren't you?" he asked. "Good man. Your father. Damn shame what happened with all this." I asked him what he meant. He suddenly got busy with the machine. I introduced myself properly the next time. Brought him coffee. Learned his name was Walt. Retired contractor. Part-time maintenance now. "Your daddy fought the survey change for a year," he told me quietly. "Then he got sick, and fighting got harder than living. I always figured somebody'd pick it back up." That night I found a manila folder in my father's closet, buried under old tax returns, labeled in his shaking handwriting, "Vas Lease, 1998. Inside was a single yellowed page. A lease agreement between my grandfather and a young couple named Harold and Regina Voss for grazing rights on the back acreage. 10 years. Expired 2008. Never renewed. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, staring at Regina Voss's signature from 28 years ago, young and looping and unmistakable, and understood for the first time that this woman had known exactly whose land she was standing on since long before I ever came home. The next HOA newsletter arrived with my name in it, not directly, but everyone knew who a certain resident disputing established property lines referred to. Comment sections online filled with strangers calling me entitled, ungrateful, a troublemaker trying to seize community land for personal profit. Denise warned me over the fence one evening. Voice low. "She's already started calling people. Telling them you're trying to shut down the shopping center jobs. People believe her. Callie. She's been running this place a long time. And she doesn't lose." I decided to be smarter than angry. I requested the original 1998 lease renewal paperwork from the HOA archive, citing my rights as a trust beneficiary. The response came back within a day. Uncharacteristically fast for that office. "No such renewal exists in our records," which was true. Expired 18 years ago. And nothing was ever signed to extend it. Which meant, under Georgia law, grazing rights had reverted entirely to my family the moment that decade ended, years before Cedar Hollow Commons broke ground. I brought the expired lease to a county land records clerk named Priya, who'd known my father from his years volunteering at the Historical Society. She read it twice, frowned, and said, "This is going to open something up that a lot of people don't want opened." Priya pulled the original 1998 subdivision plat for me, the one filed before Cedar Hollow Estates expanded commercially. The rear parcel lines matched my grandfather's deed almost perfectly, until a 2011 correction survey moved them 40 feet, conveniently swallowing the exact footprint the shopping center now occupied. The surveyor listed on that 2011 correction was a man named Chester Doyle. Priya's eyebrows rose when she saw the name. "Chester Doyle lost his license 2 years after this filing," she said. "Ethics violation." But I remember the name. That night, someone slashed all 4 tires on my car in my own driveway. No note, no witnesses. Security camera conveniently malfunctioning, according to the HOA's private patrol who'd driven past twice that evening. Per the log Denise showed me the next day. I filed a police report anyway, even knowing nothing would come of it in a town where the responding deputy's wife sat on Regina's garden committee. The officer was polite, professional, and utterly uninterested in connecting dots I hadn't yet said out loud. Regina showed up at my door the following afternoon, holding a fruit basket like an olive branch made of apples and false sympathy. "I heard about your tires," she said. "Terrible what happens in neighborhoods these days. I do hope you're not spreading yourself too thin, dear, chasing old paperwork." I thanked her for the basket and said nothing about the lease, the survey, or Chester Doyle. Her eyes flicked, just once, to the folder sitting on my kitchen counter before she caught herself. It was the first real crack I'd seen in her composure, and I intended to remember it. I hired an attorney the following week. A sharp, unhurried woman named Marisol Franco who specialized in property disputes and clearly relished a good HOA scandal. She read the expired lease, the correction survey, and Chester Doyle's disciplinary record, and let out a low whistle. "This isn't a boundary dispute," Marisol said. "This looks like a fraudulent replatting scheme built on land your family never surrendered. If I'm right, that entire commercial development is sitting, legally, on your trust's property." I asked her what that meant for the 12 buildings. She smiled. "And we go thorough." Marisol filed a formal records request for every document connected to the 2011 correction survey, the commercial development permits, and Chester Doyle's original submission. The HOA's response took 3 weeks and arrived heavily redacted, which Marisol said told her more than an unredacted copy ever could have. Meanwhile, the fence fines kept coming. 200 a day, compounding, a lien threatened against a house I hadn't even finished mourning in. I paid nothing and documented everything, learning quickly that Regina's real weapon wasn't lawyers. It was exhaustion, delivered one certified letter at a time. At the next open HOA meeting, I sat in the back, saying nothing, just watching. Regina ran the agenda with practiced charm, praising the tremendous economic impact of Cedar Hollow Commons, thanking herself, essentially, in front of 40 nodding homeowners who had no idea what sat beneath the concrete. A board member named Arthur Kim, quiet, older, glasses always sliding down his nose, caught my eye near the end of the meeting and lingered by the coffee station afterward. "You're asking the right questions," he murmured, not looking at me directly. "Be careful who hears you asking them." I met Arthur for coffee 2 days later, away from Cedar Hollow entirely, at a diner off the highway. He'd served on the board for 6 years and had grown increasingly uneasy about how development decisions got made. Always Regina's committee, always closed session, always finalized before the vote even happened. She controls the vote count before the meeting starts, Arthur said. Proxies. Mostly. Half the homeowners sign generic proxy forms and never read what they're agreeing to. She's used them to approve every commercial expansion since 2012, including the one built on your land. I asked if he had proof. He said he was working on it. Arthur mentioned, almost in passing, that Regina's son-in-law, Brett Callahan, owned the construction company that built all 12 Cedar Hollow Commons buildings, awarded the contract without competitive bidding, at rates nearly double the county average, funded partly through mandatory HOA development assessments charged to every homeowner. I sat with that fact for a long moment. Regina wasn't just protecting a boundary error. She was protecting a pipeline, homeowner assessments into her family's construction company. Land she didn't legally own turned into commercial rent. And 11 years of unquestioned authority holding the entire structure together. Marisol's second records request came back with something the HOA hadn't managed to redact in time. An internal email from 2011. Regina to Chester Doyle. Reading only, same terms as before. Handle the lines. Printed it and slid it across her desk like a winning hand of cards. Same terms as before, Marisol repeated. That implies a prior arrangement. Somewhere, there's an earlier version of whatever Chester Doyle did for her. I thought immediately of Walt, the maintenance man, and his careful phrase, "Your daddy fought the survey change for a year." I found Walt again at the storage facility and asked him directly what he remembered from before my father got sick. He glanced around before answering. There was a first survey attempt in 2009, before the one that stuck. Your daddy caught it right away and fought it down. Doyle redid it quieter in 2011. That meant Regina had tried this once already, years before Cedar Hollow Commons existed, and my father had stopped her. A fight he'd apparently never mentioned to me, maybe to spare me, maybe because by the time he got sick, he thought he'd truly won it. I dug through his old files again and found a second folder. Thinner. Labeled only 2009. Inside was a single handwritten letter, unsent, addressed to the County Surveyor's Ethics Board, detailing irregular boundary adjustments requested by R. Voss on parcel adjoining Reyes Trust land. He'd never mailed it. Marisol read the unsent letter twice and said quietly, "This is the difference between a boundary dispute and a pattern. Pattern," she explained, was much harder for a judge to dismiss as coincidence, misunderstanding, or an honest surveying mistake made under pressure. The HOA responded to Marisol's inquiries with a formal letter reminding me of community harmony obligations and warning that continued disruptive
behavior could result in a hearing before the Compliance Committee, chaired, unsurprisingly, by Regina Voss herself, with full authority to levy fines.
I learned later that Brett Callahan's construction company had quietly begun a 13th building, a parking structure, breaking ground 2 weeks after my
first questions at the HOA meeting, as though Regina intended to bury the disputed footprint under so much concrete that no court would ever want to unbuild it.
Denise brought me a casserole one evening, unprompted, and admitted quietly that half the neighborhood was starting to whisper differently now. Not about me being a troublemaker, but about why the fence fines had started right after I mentioned the commercial parcel, and not a moment before. Regina called an emergency compliance hearing regarding my fence with only 4 days' notice. Technically within HOA bylaws, but clearly timed to catch me before Marisol could properly prepare. I asked for a 2-week postponement to secure counsel. The board, all Regina's appointees, denied it unanimously. The hearing took place in the same clubhouse. Regina at the same head table, gavel again in hand. She read the violation aloud with theatrical gravity, as though my grandfather's 40-year-old fence represented some grave threat to community property values rather than a boundary older than the HOA itself. I stood and calmly presented the county GIS overlay, the 1998 expired lease, and a photograph of the original 1974 fence permit filed by my grandfather, predating the HOA's existence by over a decade. A ripple moved through the small audience. Regina's gavel came down harder than necessary. Historical documents, Regina said dismissively, don't override current HOA covenants. Arthur Kim, from his seat on the board, spoke up for the first time in years. According to Denise later. Actually, Regina, they might. Setback covenants can't retroactively criminalize a pre-existing structure. That's basic property law. The room went very quiet. Regina's smile stayed fixed in place, but her jaw tightened visibly, and she called for an immediate vote to table the matter pending further review. A stall tactic Arthur later told me was standard whenever she sensed she was about to lose control of a room. I left that meeting with the fines paused but not dismissed, and the distinct feeling that I just watched a woman recalibrate in real time, no longer treating me as an annoyance to be fined into submission, but as an actual threat requiring a sharper, more careful response. That sharper response arrived within the week. A concerned resident, unnamed, filed a complaint alleging I'd been harassing HOA staff and threatening board members, triggering an internal review that, conveniently, only Regina had the authority to initiate, investigate, and conclude according to committee bylaws. Marisol wasn't worried. Losing, she said. They stop attacking your evidence and start attacking your character, because the evidence is the part they can't argue with. Still, watching my own neighbors start to eye me warily at the mailbox stung more than I expected. I began recording every interaction after that. Dates, times, names, screenshots of the online community forum where an account named Millbrook Mom 22 had started posting increasingly personal comments about me, my job, my divorce 2 years prior, details that felt uncomfortably specific for a random neighbor. Arthur confirmed my suspicion quietly over coffee. Millbrook Mom 22 posts within minutes of every board decision. Always defending Regina, always attacking whoever's questioning her. I've watched the login timestamps on the community portal. It traces back to an IP address registered to the HOA management office. I didn't confront Regina directly about the account. Instead, Marisol filed it away as one more thread in a growing pattern. Expired leases, an ethics-violating surveyor, a son-in-law's no-bid contracts, anonymous online harassment, all circling back, eventually, to the same woman's signature and the same woman's motive. Then came the offer. Envelope to my door. No return address, containing a cash buyout proposal for my remaining acreage at roughly a third of its assessed value. With a note, a generous gesture from a neighbor who wants only peace. No need to sign anything publicly. I photographed the envelope, the cash offer letter, and the handwriting on the note before calling Marisol, who confirmed what I already suspected. The paper stock matched HOA letterhead exactly, minus the header, and the handwriting resembled samples from Regina's own meeting minutes archived at the county office. I declined the offer in writing, calmly, keeping a copy for our growing file. 3 days later, my homeowner's insurance company called, informing me that an anonymous complaint had triggered a property inspection request alleging unsafe structural conditions on my home. The same home I'd inspected myself, professionally, weeks earlier. The inspector who arrived seemed embarrassed by the whole visit, admitting off the record that the complaint had come through unusual channels, bypassing the normal municipal process entirely. He found nothing wrong. Of course, because there was nothing wrong. Only someone determined to manufacture a crisis out of nothing. I started keeping a whiteboard in my kitchen, mapping every incident by date. Fence fine, tire slashing, buyout offer, fake safety complaint, all radiating outward from a single center point, the moment I'd asked one polite question about a boundary line at an HOA meeting. Denise stopped by again, this time visibly shaken, and told me Regina had cornered her at the grocery store, casually mentioning that people who associate with troublemakers sometimes find their own HOA violation history reviewed more closely. Denise had 3 unpaid parking fines from years back. She understood the threat perfectly. I realized then how the machine actually worked. Regina didn't need everyone to love her. She only needed enough people afraid of losing their own small comforts, waived fines, quiet favors, overlooked violations that nobody dared stand beside whoever she decided to target that season. Marisol filed a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Commission regarding Chester Doyle's 2011 survey, attaching the 2009 unsent letter, the expired lease, and the internal same terms as before email as supporting evidence. The commission confirmed receipt and opened a preliminary inquiry within 2 weeks. Regina must have heard about the inquiry before I did, because the HOA suddenly announced an accelerated community beautification initiative requiring immediate removal of non-conforming structures throughout the neighborhood, a policy that, remarkably, applied to exactly one fence in the entire subdivision. I refused to remove it, citing the pending state inquiry and the unresolved boundary question, and Marisol sent a formal cease and desist regarding further enforcement action until the survey dispute concluded. For the first time, the HOA's response came back noticeably slower, more measured, almost hesitant. That hesitation told me more than any document could have. Regina Voss, for the first time in 11 years, was no longer entirely certain she controlled every outcome in her own neighborhood, and the crack I'd first noticed over that fruit basket had widened into something she could no longer smooth over with a smile. For a few weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over Millbrook Ridge. No new fines, no anonymous complaints, no cash offers. Regina appeared at the farmer's market smiling, waving, business as usual, as though daring the neighborhood to believe nothing was actually happening beneath the surface calm. I used the pause to breathe. Honestly, I finished clearing out my father's closet, found photographs of him and my grandfather standing on that back acreage decades ago, laughing, unaware their land would one day anchor a fight neither of them lived to see resolved. Marisol used the quiet differently, methodically. She subpoenaed Cedar Hollow Commons' original financing documents through discovery, since the HOA had, unwisely, filed a civil motion challenging the state inquiry's jurisdiction, which opened the door to formal discovery neither side could easily close again. The financing documents named Brett Callahan's company as general contractor and revealed something unexpected: a silent investor listed only as RVH Holdings LLC.
Registered to an address matching Regina's own house. Filed just months before construction began on land whose ownership was, at minimum, actively disputed.
She didn't just approve the project, Marisol said, studying the LLC filing. She financially benefited from it directly, using a boundary line her own surveyor allegedly falsified, while sitting as HOA president reviewing her own project's compliance. That's not a gray area. That's a conflict of interest with a name and address. I drove past Cedar Hollow Commons again that week, watching tenants come and go from the bank branch, the storage units, the little bakery that had opened in one of the retail bays. Ordinary people building ordinary lives on top of a foundation I now understood to be built on sand. Legally speaking, I felt something unexpected watching them. Not triumph, not yet, but a quiet ache for the tenants who had no idea their leases sat on disputed ground. No idea their landlord's mother-in-law had rewritten a boundary line to make it all possible in the first place. Walt found me at the fence line again. Told me he'd overheard Brett Callahan on the phone near the loading dock. Stressed. Saying something about cash flow and can't stall the 13th building much longer. The bank wants to see it finished. The parking structure, apparently, mattered more than anyone had said aloud. Arthur confirmed what Walt suspected. The HOA had taken out a significant loan against future development assessment, revenue to fund infrastructure for the new parking structure. Revenue that depended entirely on Cedar Hollow Commons remaining operational, uncontested, and generating rent. The pressure on Regina wasn't just reputational anymore. It was financial. That explained the accelerated beautification initiative, the buyout offer, the anonymous complaints. Regina wasn't simply defending pride or legacy. She was defending a financial structure that would collapse the moment a court definitively ruled the underlying land had never legally belonged to Cedar Hollow Estates at all. I started sleeping a little easier. Oddly, once I understood the shape of her fear. Fear made her predictable. Fear was why she'd tried the cash buyout before the lawsuit. Why she'd rushed the beautification order before the state inquiry. Why every move she made now was reactive instead of controlled. Marisol warned me not to mistake the quiet for surrender. People like Regina don't back down when they're cornered, she said. They escalate. The loan pressure, the state inquiry, all of it converging is going to force her hand soon. And it won't be gentle. She was right, of course. The quiet ended on a Tuesday, with a knock on my door at 7 in the morning. A county sheriff's deputy, apologetic but official, holding papers naming me in an emergency injunction Regina's attorney had filed overnight, alleging I posed an imminent threat to community development interests. The injunction requested an immediate restraining order barring me from interfering with Cedar Hollow Commons operations. Despite my having done nothing but ask questions, file records requests, and refuse to remove a legally protected fence. Marisol called it desperate the moment she read it. This is a woman flailing, she said. The emergency hearing was scheduled within 72 hours. A judge I'd never met, a courtroom instead of a clubhouse, and for the first time the fight moved somewhere Regina couldn't control the guest list. The agenda, or the gavel. That shift alone felt like the first real ground I'd gained. Regina arrived at the courthouse in a tailored suit instead of linen, flanked by an attorney who looked considerably more expensive than her usual HOA counsel. Funded, Marisol suspected quietly, through the very RVH Holdings LLC we'd already flagged in discovery filings weeks earlier. Her attorney argued that my pattern of disruptive inquiry had damaged Cedar Hollow Commons tenant relationships and threatened ongoing financing,
painting me as a bitter, grieving woman lashing out at a thriving community project rather than someone defending an inherited legal claim to disputed land.
Marisol responded by entering into the court record the expired 1998 lease, the 2009 unsent ethics letter, Chester Doyle's disciplinary history, the same terms as before email, and the RVH Holdings filing all at once. Altogether, a pattern too tightly woven for any judge to dismiss as coincidence. The judge, a measured woman named Judge Alvarez, read through the exhibits with visible interest, occasionally glancing up at Regina with an expression I couldn't quite read, but that Regina clearly found uncomfortable, judging by how tightly she gripped her own folded hands. I'm not prepared to grant an emergency injunction against a property owner defending a disputed boundary claim supported by this much-documented history, Judge Alvarez finally said. If anything, this filing raises serious questions about the underlying development itself. Regina's attorney's confident posture visibly deflated. The injunction was denied outright, and Judge Alvarez additionally ordered both parties into a formal boundary determination hearing, consolidating the property dispute, the surveyor's ethics inquiry, and the HOA's civil jurisdiction challenge into a single case with a firm court date 6 weeks out. Regina left the courthouse without speaking to reporters, without her usual composed smile, moving fast toward her Escalade while her attorney fielded a single question from a local news stringer who'd apparently caught wind of the case through the State Real Estate Commission's public docket. The local paper ran a small article 2 days later. Boundary dispute raises questions about Cedar Hollow commercial development. Careful, neutral language, but enough that half the neighborhood suddenly had a name for the unease they'd been feeling since the fence fines first started. Homeowners who'd never spoken to me directly began stopping me at the mailbox, at the grocery store, asking careful questions about the article, about the survey, about whether their own home values were somehow entangled in whatever was unfolding behind Cedar Hollow Commons beige facades. Denise, emboldened, finally admitted publicly at the next open HOA meeting that Regina had implied consequences over her old parking fines if she associated with me. 2 other homeowners, hearing her speak, quietly admitted similar conversations of their own. Hush threats dressed up as friendly advice. Arthur used the moment to formally request an independent audit of HOA finances, citing the RVH Holdings connection and the undisclosed loan against future development assessments. Regina objected furiously, calling it an unnecessary distraction from community progress. But for the first time, 2 other board members sided against her. The vote to approve an independent audit passed 4-3. The first vote Regina had lost in 11 years as HOA president, and the silence that followed her realization of that fact was, Denise told me later, the loudest silence she'd ever witnessed in that clubhouse. Regina requested a private meeting with me the following week. No lawyers, just neighbors talking, held at a coffee shop outside the subdivision entirely. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, with Marisol's blessing and a small recorder tucked discreetly in my jacket pocket. Just in case. She arrived without the usual armor of linen and confidence, looking tired in a way I hadn't seen on her before. I built something real here, she said quietly. 12 buildings. Jobs. A thriving little district. Are you really willing to tear all of that down over 40 feet of grass? I told her it was never about 40 feet of grass. It was about a lease that expired, a survey that lied, and 11 years of a woman deciding whose land mattered and whose didn't, based entirely on who could afford to fight back and who couldn't yet. Your father could have fought harder, she said, an edge slipping into her voice. He knew. He just didn't have the stomach for it near the end. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a very clear, very quiet resolve. He had a letter he never sent, I said. I found it. 9. I know Doyle redid it quieter in 2011. I know about RVH Holdings. Regina's face didn't move much, but her hand, wrapped around her coffee cup, went very still. You don't know anything, she said. Too quickly, too sharply for someone who supposedly had nothing to hide. You know pieces, without context. I said nothing back, letting the silence do what silence often does to people and used to losing control of a conversation. She left first, coffee half finished, composure visibly cracked in a way the whole neighborhood would have found unrecognizable. I sat there a moment longer, replaying her words. He knew. He always knew. And wondering exactly how much my father had carried alone before he stopped fighting. Marisol listened to the recording that evening and highlighted one phrase in particular. Your father could have fought harder. He just didn't have the stomach for it near the end. That's an admission, she said.
She just confirmed she knew this dispute existed.
The independent audit, meanwhile, moved forward under Arthur's oversight, and preliminary findings leaked within days. Irregularities in the Development Assessment Fund, payments routed through RVH Holdings that didn't match any legitimate expense category, and a pattern of no-bid contracts awarded exclusively to Brett Callahan's company since 2012. Homeowners who'd paid those assessments for years, believing them standard maintenance fees, began demanding answers at every subsequent meeting, no longer whispering in parking lots but standing up, microphone in hand, asking Regina directly where exactly their money had gone. Regina's answers grew increasingly evasive, citing confidential vendor agreements and complex financial structures beyond most homeowners' understanding. A tone that had worked for 11 years but now landed differently in a room full of people who just read an audit questioning her own family's finances. I attended those meetings now, quietly, in the back, watching the same woman who'd once dismissed me as a grieving troublemaker chasing paperwork ghosts slowly lose her grip on a room she'd once commanded with a single raised eyebrow and a well-timed gavel strike. Brett Callahan showed up to one meeting himself, visibly frustrated, insisting the 13th building parking structure needed to break ground immediately, regardless of ongoing distractions, revealing more about the financial pressure crushing them than any audit finding had managed to expose on its own. Arthur pulled me aside after that meeting and mentioned, carefully, that he'd requested board meeting minutes going back to 2011. The year of Doyle's correction survey, and found something odd. An entire month of minutes missing entirely from the official HOA archive, right around the survey filing date. Priya, at the county office, helped me track down an alternate copy, the State Real Estate Commission, as part of their inquiry into Chester Doyle, had subpoenaed those same 2011 HOA minutes months earlier. meaning a complete copy existed somewhere outside Regina's control entirely. The State Commission agreed to release relevant excerpts to Marisol under the ongoing inquiry. And what arrived confirmed everything Arthur suspected, a closed session vote. Authorizing boundary clarification services from Chester Doyle. Approved by Regina alone under an emergency provision that technically required, but never received, board consensus. She forged consensus on a vote that never happened, Marisol said, reading the minutes twice to be sure. That's not just a civil boundary issue anymore, Callie. Depending on how the state characterizes it, that starts looking like fraud, and possibly falsifying official association records. I felt something shift in my chest reading that finding, not quite triumph. Still not quite triumph, but something steadier. The sense that this was no longer just my word against a well-liked, well-connected woman's reputation. There was a paper trail now, thick enough that even her own attorney would struggle to explain it away cleanly. Regina, perhaps sensing the walls tightening, tried one more angle, a public statement at the following meeting, framing herself as a visionary leader unfairly targeted by a disgruntled family still processing grief. Insisting the entire boundary matter was a misunderstanding she personally intended to resolve generously once tempers cooled. But Walt, quiet Walt, who'd spent 30 years fixing things around Cedar Hollow without anyone paying him much mind, stood up during public comment for the first time in his life and said he remembered my father fighting this exact battle back in 2009, and that Regina had known about it the whole time. The room's reaction to Walt's words surprised even me. Not disbelief, but recognition, as though half the longtime residents had always sensed something unresolved beneath Cedar Hollow's polished surface and had simply been waiting for permission to say so out loud without fear of retaliation. Regina adjourned the meeting abruptly after Walt's comment, gavel cracking down harder than protocol required. Her composure fully gone now, replaced by something sharper, more brittle. The look of a woman realizing her carefully built kingdom had begun eroding from underneath her own feet. I drove home that night thinking about my father's unsent letter, wondering if he'd have found some peace watching a quiet maintenance man finally say, out loud, in front of the entire neighborhood, the thing he himself had never found the strength to finish fighting for. 2 days later, my car's brakes failed on the highway exit ramp near Cedar Hollow. A slow leak a mechanic later confirmed had been deliberately loosened rather than naturally worn. Evidence he documented carefully at my request, understanding immediately why I wanted it on record. I wasn't hurt, thankfully, just shaken, coasting to a stop on the shoulder with my heart pounding harder than it had through any HOA meeting, any injunction hearing, any cold conversation over coffee with a woman who'd apparently decided paperwork alone wasn't going to stop me anymore. Marisol reported the tampering to the sheriff's department immediately, connecting it explicitly to the ongoing property dispute and prior tire slashing incident, finally prompting a detective, rather than a board patrol officer, to take an actual interest in the pattern forming around Cedar Hollow estates. The detective, a methodical woman named Sergeant Ruiz, requested the HOA's private security footage from the night of the tire slashing, footage previously reported as malfunctioning, and discovered it had, in fact, been recorded and later deliberately deleted from the system 3 days after my police report. Deleting evidence connected to an active police report carried its own legal weight entirely separate from any boundary dispute. And Sergeant Ruiz made that Very clear during her first formal interview with the HOA's private security contractor, who suddenly remembered quite a lot once his own liability became clear. The security contractor admitted, under pressure, that Regina herself had personally requested the footage be removed to protect the community's reputation during a sensitive time, a request he'd complied with. He now realized, without fully understanding the legal risk he'd absorbed on her behalf. Sergeant Ruiz's report, combined with Marisol's existing civil case file, began painting a picture far larger than a simple boundary dispute. Property fraud, falsified board minutes, deleted evidence, and now, potentially, tampering with a vehicle, all circling back to one woman's determination to protect 12 buildings built on land she'd known wasn't hers. Regina, cornered on multiple fronts now, made her boldest move yet, filing a defamation lawsuit against me personally, claiming my public accusations had damaged her reputation and Cedar Hollow Commons tenant relationships, seeking damages that would have bankrupted most homeowners in the subdivision outright. Marisol wasn't rattled. Truth is an absolute defense to defamation, she reminded me calmly. And everything you've said publicly is backed by state records, county filings, and sworn testimony. If anything, this lawsuit hands us formal discovery rights we didn't even have to ask for. I signed the response Marisol prepared with a steadiness that surprised me, understanding fully now that Regina wasn't escalating from strength anymore, but from panic, the exact kind of panic that made powerful people reach for weapons far too dangerous and far too visible for their own good. The defamation suit backfired almost immediately once discovery opened both directions, forcing Regina's attorney to produce financial records connecting RVH Holdings directly to her personal accounts, records her own lawsuit had inadvertently made fair game in a case she'd chosen to file herself. Brett Callahan's construction company, facing its own mounting financial pressure from the stalled parking structure, filed an emergency motion demanding the boundary dispute be expedited, inadvertently confirming under oath that the bank financing the 13th building required clear, undisputed title before releasing further construction funds. That single sworn statement mattered enormously. Marisol explained it proved, from Regina's own family's mouth, that even the people benefiting from the fraudulent boundary understood, at a fundamental financial level, that clear ownership had never actually existed the way Cedar Hollow Commons marketing materials implied. Regina, increasingly desperate, began pressuring individual board members privately to reverse the audit vote. According to Arthur, who received a late-night phone call from her personally, alternating between flattery and thinly veiled threats about certain violations she claimed to have overlooked in his own property history for years. Arthur recorded that call, legally, under Georgia's one-party consent laws, and delivered a copy directly to Sergeant Ruiz the following morning, adding witness intimidation to a growing list of allegations now surrounding a woman who'd spent 11 years being the one making the accusations instead of receiving them. The State Real Estate Commission, meanwhile, formally revoked whatever remained of Chester Doyle's ability to practice, citing the newly discovered pattern of falsified survey corrections stretching back to 2009, and referred the entire matter, unprompted, to the district attorney's office for potential criminal review. Chester Doyle, facing his own legal exposure now, agreed to cooperate fully with investigators in exchange for leniency, providing a sworn statement confirming Regina had paid him, in cash, twice, once in 2009 for an attempt my father successfully blocked, and again in 2011 for the correction that finally stuck. That sworn statement was the twist even Marisol hadn't fully anticipated. Direct testimony. Under oath. From the very surveyor Regina had used. Confirming payment, intent, and knowledge. Transforming the entire case from a strong civil claim into something the district attorney's office could no longer politely ignore. I drove out to the old back acreage that evening, past the beige buildings and the half-finished parking structure standing frozen mid-construction, and stood where my grandfather's barn used to be, feeling, for the first time since coming home, something close to steady ground beneath my feet. Regina's public image, so carefully maintained for over a decade, began collapsing in real time. The local paper ran a follow-up article naming RVH Holdings, the deleted security footage, and Chester Doyle's sworn statement, no longer using careful neutral language but the plain word fraud. Homeowners who'd defended her for years, who'd waved off my early questions as paperwork ghosts and grief, now found themselves publicly recalculating just how much of Cedar Hollow Estate's 11-year reputation had been built on the same quiet willingness to look away that had let this go on so long. Regina requested emergency mediation through Marisol, offering, for the first time, a genuine settlement, full transfer of the disputed acreage back to the Reyes Trust, a public correction of the boundary records, and a payment covering legal fees, in exchange for dropping the defamation suit and staying quiet about the fraud allegations. Marisol relayed the offer with visible skepticism. "It's generous. On paper," she said. "But it's also an attempt to buy silence before the district attorney's investigation gathers real momentum. Once criminal charges are involved, this stops being entirely yours or mine to settle quietly anyway." I thought about my father's unsent letter, about Walt finally speaking up after 30 silent years, about Denise's parking fines and Arthur's late-night threatening phone call, and realized quiet settlement money wasn't actually what I wanted anymore. Not when so many other people had been quietly harmed along the way too. I declined the settlement, formally, through Marisol, requesting instead a full public accounting through the courts and full cooperation with the ongoing criminal referral. Understanding clearly that this decision would prolong my own fight but might finally end the pattern for everyone else Regina had ever controlled through fear. Regina's attorney withdrew from the defamation case within days of my refusal, citing irreconcilable differences in an unusually blunt filing that Marisol suspected meant the attorney had realized exactly how much criminal exposure remained attached to a client no longer worth the professional risk. Brett Callahan's construction company quietly filed for a stay on the parking structure project entirely, the bank having finally pulled promised financing once news of the fraud referral became public record, leaving the half-built 13th building standing as an unintentional monument to 11 years of unchecked ambition. The HOA board, minus Regina's usual influence over absent proxies, voted unanimously to suspend her presidency pending the outcome of the criminal referral, installing Arthur Kim as interim president, a decision Denise texted me about within minutes. 3 exclamation points and all. Regina didn't attend that vote. She sent a written statement instead, read aloud by another board member, insisting she'd only ever acted in the community's best interest, and that history would eventually vindicate the vision she'd built, even if certain small-minded neighbors couldn't currently see it. I found myself, oddly, not celebrating that night. Just tired. The particular exhaustion of a fight that had consumed nearly a year of grief that should have belonged only to my father. twisted instead into court filings, sworn statements, and a slashed tire I still sometimes dreamed about. Marisol reminded me gently that exhaustion after a long fight didn't mean the fight hadn't mattered. That closure sometimes arrived quietly, in paperwork and formal rulings, rather than the dramatic confrontation movies like to promise. I told her I was starting to understand that firsthand. The district attorney's office formally opened a criminal investigation into Regina Voss, Chester Doyle, and RVH Holdings LLC, covering fraud, falsification of official records, witness intimidation, and destruction of evidence related to the deleted security footage, a scope far wider than anyone had initially expected. News of the criminal investigation spread through Millbrook Ridge faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. Homeowners trading updates at the mailbox with a mixture of shock and something close to relief, as though a long-held tension in the neighborhood had finally found somewhere legitimate to go. Regina retreated from public life almost entirely. The white Escalade no longer seen circling the neighborhood on her usual inspection rounds. The QNRV vanity plate absent from the farmer's market parking lot for the first time in longer than most residents could remember. I received a call from a local news producer requesting an on-camera interview about the Cedar Hollow fraud case, and after discussing it carefully with Marisol, agreed to a brief, measured statement focused entirely on documented facts rather than personal grievance, exactly as she'd advised. The interview aired 2 nights later. Brief but pointed, ending with a line I hadn't planned but meant completely. This was never about offense. It was about whether a title, once faked, stays faked simply because the person who faked it had enough power to make everyone stop asking. Comments on the segment shifted noticeably from the earlier online hostility I'd weathered months before. Strangers now expressing outrage on my behalf. Several longtime Cedar Hollow residents commenting publicly for the first time about their own uneasy history with Regina's unquestioned authority over the years. Arthur, now interim president, initiated a full independent review of every commercial development approved during Regina's tenure, uncovering 2 additional smaller boundary corrections filed by Chester Doyle over the years, both benefiting HOA-adjacent projects, both now flagged for the State Commission's expanding inquiry. The scope of what Regina had built, I realized with something between horror and grim vindication, extended far beyond my grandfather's acreage, an entire pattern of quiet boundary manipulation stretching back over a decade, protected the entire time by a reputation nobody had thought to seriously question until now. Denise's old parking fines were quietly and officially waived by the new interim board. A small gesture, but one that mattered enormously to her. She told me, crying a little at her own kitchen table as she described finally feeling safe enough to speak freely at HOA meetings again. Walt received a modest but genuine thank you from Arthur's new board for his decades of quiet service and his courage in finally speaking up publicly, a moment he brushed off with characteristic modesty, though Denise swore she saw him wipe his eyes afterward at the coffee station. I visited my father's grave that week, sat on the grass beside the headstone, and told him, out loud, about the unsent letter, about Walt, about Doyle's sworn confession, about the criminal investigation now unraveling everything he'd once tried and failed to stop alone. All those years ago, I felt no need to forgive Regina in that moment. Not yet, maybe not ever fully. But I did feel something settle in my chest that hadn't been settled since I first found that manila folder in his closet. The sense that his fight, unfinished as it was, had mattered after all. The district attorney's office, building its case methodically, subpoenaed Regina's personal financial records directly, tracing RVH Holdings' cash flow back through years of HOA development assessments, constructing a financial map far more damning than even Marisol's original discovery requests had managed to surface. Brett Callahan, facing his own potential exposure as a beneficiary of the scheme, hired separate counsel and began quietly cooperating with investigators, providing internal company communications that further confirmed Regina's direct financial involvement and knowledge of the boundary fraud from its earliest planning stages. Regina, cornered from every direction now, criminal investigation, financial exposure, suspended presidency, and a son-in-law no longer willing to protect her at his own legal expense, made one final desperate move that would end up defining exactly how the entire ordeal concluded for everyone watching. She showed up at my house late one evening. No fruit basket this time. No linen suit. Just a woman in a plain coat asking, quietly, if she could speak with me one last time before everything gets decided by people who don't understand what I actually built here. I let her in, cautiously, recorder running openly this time. No pretense between us anymore about what this conversation actually was. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd first laid out the whiteboard mapping every incident, and looked, for once, genuinely uncertain of herself. I never meant for it to go this far, she said. It started small. Nobody was using that land anyway. Your father wasn't farming it. I thought I was just making something useful out of nothing. I let the silence sit between us. It wasn't nothing, I finally said. It was my grandfather's, then my father's, then mine. You knew that in 1998 when you signed a lease for it. You knew it in 2009 when my father stopped you the first time. You just decided your plans mattered more than the truth. She didn't argue that point, which surprised me more than anything else she'd said all evening. Instead, she asked, almost pleadingly, whether I intended to push for criminal charges personally, or whether there was still some version of this where she could quietly retire, keep her home, disappear from public life. I told her honestly that the criminal investigation was no longer mine to control, that the district attorney's office had its own evidence now, Doyle's confession, the deleted footage, the falsified board minutes, independent of anything I personally chose to pursue or forgive on my own behalf. She left that night without another word, and I sat at the table long after, recorder still running, feeling less like I'd won something and more like I'd simply watched a carefully constructed persona finally run out of rooms left to hide in. One door at a time. The recording, turned over to Sergeant Ruiz the following morning, contained something Marisol immediately flagged as significant, Regina's admission that she'd known. The land wasn't nothing, that she'd known about the 1998 lease, the 2009 attempt, and my father's successful objection to it. All stated plainly, unprompted, on tape. Sergeant Ruiz called it, off the record, about as clean a confession as we ever get outside a formal interrogation room, and the district attorney's office moved quickly afterward to finalize charges. No longer waiting on additional corroborating evidence they now considered largely unnecessary. 2 weeks later, Regina Voss was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, falsification of official records, witness intimidation, and destruction of evidence. Her arraignment covered by local news cameras stationed outside the same courthouse where she'd once tried to have me legally silenced. I didn't attend the arraignment myself, choosing instead to spend that morning walking the back acreage with Marisol. measuring, informally, exactly where my grandfather's barn had once stood, where the true boundary line ran, where 12 buildings and a half-finished parking structure now sat on ground that was, finally, legally, undeniably mine. The formal boundary determination hearing, still scheduled independently of the criminal case, concluded far more quickly than expected once Judge Alvarez reviewed the mounting evidence, ruling decisively that the 2011 correction survey was void, restoring the original 1998 boundary lines in full, immediately, without further appeal permitted. That ruling meant, in plain terms, that all 12 Cedar Hollow Commons buildings, and the unfinished 13th, sat entirely on land legally belonging to the Reyes Family Trust, a fact Marisol explained carefully would take time to fully untangle, but one that fundamentally changed everything going forward. The HOA, facing its own legal exposure for authorizing development on land it never legally controlled, entered emergency negotiations with Marisol regarding lease terms, back rent, and compensation, negotiations conducted now from a position of profound legal weakness rather than the confident authority Regina had once wielded so effortlessly. Brett Callahan's construction company, already reeling from stalled financing, ultimately agreed to a settlement transferring partial ownership stakes in several completed buildings directly to the Reyes Trust in exchange for avoiding a lengthy, expensive, and increasingly unwinnable civil trial over the disputed development. I sat with Marisol for hours reviewing the settlement terms, still slightly disoriented by the idea that the same commercial strip built specifically to erase my family's claim to that land might soon generate rental income for that exact family. An irony neither of us found particularly subtle. The tenants, the bakery owner, the dental office, the small accounting firm renting space in the retail bay, received formal notice of the ownership transfer, along with assurance from Marisol's office that existing leases would be honored fully. Since none of this fight had ever been about punishing people who'd simply rented storefronts in good faith, Denise organized, somewhat to my surprise, an informal neighborhood gathering at the community garden, not sanctioned by any HOA committee, just neighbors bringing dishes and lawn chairs, marking, in their own quiet way, the end of an era defined for over a decade by fear disguised as friendliness. Walt showed up too, sitting near the garden's edge with a paper plate of casserole, telling anyone who'd listen the story of my father's original 2009 fight, finally given the space and audience it had always deserved, finally free of the shadow it had lived under for 17 quiet years. Arthur announced at the gathering, informally, that the interim board intended to hold a formal election for a permanent HOA president within the month. The first genuinely contested election Cedar Hollow Estates had seen since Regina first took office over a decade earlier. I felt no interest in running for that position myself, having spent enough of the past year fighting for basic ownership of my own inherited land. But I did agree, at Arthur's request, to serve temporarily on the newly reconstituted audit committee, ensuring the fund irregularities got fully resolved. Regina's criminal case moved through pretrial proceedings over the following months, her legal team ultimately advising a plea agreement rather than risking trial. Against a district attorney's office holding sworn testimony, deleted evidence records, financial paper trails, and her own recorded admission from my kitchen table. She pleaded guilty to reduced charges of fraud and falsification of official records, in exchange for the intimidation and evidence destruction charges being dropped, receiving a sentence of probation, substantial restitution, and a formal, permanent ban from holding any HOA or homeowners association leadership position statewide. I attended the sentencing hearing, quietly, in the back row, watching a woman who'd once commanded an entire neighborhood's fear stand instead before a judge who addressed her, plainly and without ceremony, as simply another defendant who'd broken the law for personal gain. Judge Alvarez, reading the restitution order aloud, noted specifically that the harm extended well beyond one family's boundary dispute, citing the broader pattern of intimidation, financial manipulation, and abuse of community trust that had touched dozens of Millbrook Ridge homeowners over more than a decade. Regina didn't look at me during the hearing. Not once. Her attention fixed somewhere on the table in front of her, and I found, watching her there, that I didn't particularly need her to look at me either. The paperwork had already said everything that needed saying. Chester Doyle received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation, probation, and a permanent revocation of any future surveying license. A small consolation, Marisol noted, but one that at least ensured no future homeowner would ever again fall victim to a boundary line he'd been paid to falsify. Brett Callahan avoided criminal charges entirely, having cooperated early and thoroughly, though his construction company's reputation in the county took a lasting hit, several other municipalities quietly declining to renew existing contracts once the Cedar Hollow fraud case became public record locally. I stood at the edge of the back acreage one final time that season, watching autumn light settle over 12 buildings that had once represented, to me, everything unjust about how quietly power could rewrite the truth when nobody with enough resources bothered to push back hard enough. Soon enough, Arthur called an emergency HOA meeting the following week, open to the entire neighborhood, to formally present the audit committee's completed financial findings before the newly scheduled presidential election, and the clubhouse filled beyond capacity for the first time in anyone's memory of Cedar Hollow Estates. I sat near the front this time, not the back, Marisol beside me, as Arthur laid out, methodically, exactly how 11 years of development assessments had funneled money toward RVH Holdings and Brett Callahan's company. Dollar amounts homeowners had paid without ever fully understanding where the money actually went. A homeowner near the back, someone I'd never spoken to before, stood and asked the question that seemed to hang over the entire room. So what happens now? To the buildings, the land, all of it. Arthur turned, deferring, understandably, to Marisol and me to answer that part ourselves. I stood, feeling steadier than I expected, and explained plainly that the Reyes Family Trust now held legal ownership of the underlying land beneath Cedar Hollow Commons, that existing tenant leases would be honored, and that the HOA itself would need to formally renegotiate its relationship to the entire commercial district going forward. Someone asked, quietly but audibly, whether that meant I'd become their landlord now, in a sense, and I answered honestly that yes, in a strange and fairly unwanted turn of events. I had the exact 12 buildings built to erase my family's claim now generating income for that same family instead. A ripple of something moved through the room at that. Not hostility. Something closer to disbelief mixed with reluctant amusement. Several people actually, laughing quietly at the sheer irony of it. An irony I'd stopped finding funny months ago but understood, watching them, why it landed that way for everyone else. Arthur moved the meeting toward its final agenda item, nominations for permanent HOA president, and Denise, to my genuine surprise, stood up and nominated Arthur Kim himself, citing his audit work, his willingness to challenge Regina publicly, and his steady handling of the interim presidency these past months. Arthur accepted the nomination hesitantly, admitting openly that he'd never particularly wanted the role, that he'd only pushed for accountability because nobody else seemed willing to, a kind of humility that, judging by the room's reaction, made him considerably more trusted than Regina's polished confidence ever had. No one else stepped forward to challenge the nomination, and the room voted, by simple show of hands, to confirm Arthur as Cedar Hollow Estates' new permanent HOA president, effective immediately, closing out, formally and almost anticlimactically, the era Regina Voss had once ruled so completely. I left that meeting feeling something I hadn't expected to feel after nearly a year of fighting. Not quite peace yet, but something adjacent to it. The sense that the machine Regina had built to protect herself had finally, fully, dismantled itself under the simple weight of documented truth. Marisol finalized the last of the civil settlement paperwork over the following weeks, formally transferring undisputed title of the back acreage, along with negotiated, partial ownership stakes in several Cedar Hollow Commons buildings, into the Reyes Family Trust, a document nearly 30 years in the making, finally signed and recorded. I drove to the county office myself to watch Priya file the corrected boundary records personally, standing beside her at the counter as she stamped the document, smiling at me in a way that felt like she understood exactly how long a road it had taken to reach this particular, unremarkable-looking piece of paper. "Your father would be proud of you," Priya said simply, sliding the recorded copy across the counter. I didn't trust my voice enough to answer right away, just nodded, folded the document carefully, and carried it out to my car like something far more valuable than ordinary paperwork usually feels. I visited Walt at the storage facility one last time before the ownership transfer formally took effect, thanking him properly for everything he'd risked speaking up about, and he waved me off with characteristic modesty, saying only that he'd simply told the truth when somebody finally asked him to. The bakery owner in the retail bay, once she learned the full story, insisted on giving me a standing weekly discount, half joking that she figured her actual landlord ought to enjoy her sourdough more than the corporation she'd assumed had been quietly collecting her rent checks all along. I found myself, oddly, developing an unexpected fondness for those 12 beige buildings over the following months, not because of what they represented originally, but because of what they'd become, proof, standing in plain daylight, that a lie built patiently over years could still be undone by patience of its own. The half-finished 13th building, the parking structure, remained frozen mid-construction for a while, a strange concrete skeleton at the edge of the property, until the trust ultimately voted to complete it modestly, repurposing it into additional community parking rather than the profit-driven expansion Regina had originally envisioned. Denise's parking fines stayed permanently waived under Arthur's new board, and she became, somewhat unexpectedly, one of the audit committee's most enthusiastic volunteers, saying she finally understood why nobody had ever properly explained where the assessment money went, and intended to make sure that never happened again. Arthur's first major initiative as permanent president involved rewriting the HOA bylaws entirely, removing the closed session voting loopholes Regina had exploited for over a decade, requiring public recorded votes for any development decision, and establishing term limits no future president could quietly maneuver around. I attended the vote approving those new bylaws, Watching homeowners who'd once whispered fearfully at the mailbox now stand up openly, ask pointed questions, and vote confidently on matters that directly affected their own community. A small but genuine transformation I hadn't fully appreciated until I saw it happen in real time. Regina, serving out her probation quietly, reportedly moved out of Millbrook Ridge entirely within the year, the white Escalade and its QNRV plate disappearing from the neighborhood for good, leaving behind a house that sold, according to Denise, considerably below its original assessed value. I thought, occasionally, about the woman who'd once brought me a fruit basket while quietly orchestrating fence fines, tire slashings, and a fraudulent boundary line, stretching back decades, and found I felt less anger toward her over time than a kind of tired, distant understanding of how far fear and pride could carry someone. Brett Callahan's company eventually rebuilt its reputation modestly in a neighboring county, taking on smaller, more transparently bid projects. And I heard, secondhand through Walt, that his marriage to Regina's daughter had quietly ended sometime during the criminal proceedings, though I never confirmed those details personally. I kept my father's unsent 2009 letter framed, eventually, not displayed prominently, just tucked in a drawer in the farmhouse office, a private reminder of the fight he'd started alone and never got to finish, and the fight I'd finally been able to carry across whatever finish line existed for something like this. The bakery started calling their most popular pastry the boundary line bun, a small inside joke among the retail tenants that somehow made its way onto local social media,
drawing curious customers who wanted to see, for themselves, the strip mall built famously on top of somebody else's inherited land.
I never quite got used to being introduced, occasionally, at community events as the woman who took down Regina Voss, a framing that always felt slightly off to me, since it had never really been about taking anyone down, only about refusing to let a lie stay quietly buried under concrete. Marisol and I stayed in touch long after the case formally closed, occasionally grabbing coffee to catch up, and she told me once, half joking, that the Cedar Hollow case had become something of a cautionary tale she now referenced with other clients navigating suspiciously convenient boundary corrections of their own. Priya sent me a card the following spring. Just a short note congratulating me on the trust's first full year managing the Cedar Hollow Commons properties successfully, adding that watching the county records finally reflect the truth had been one of the more satisfying moments of her own long career. I planted a small garden near where my grandfather's barn had once stood. Nothing elaborate, just tomatoes and herbs and a few stubborn sunflowers. Quiet, deliberate way of reclaiming the exact patch of ground Chester Doyle's falsified survey had once tried to erase from my family's name entirely. Denise brought over another casserole the day I finished planting it, joking that some things about Millbrook Ridge, at least the good things, hadn't changed at all despite everything else that had, and I found myself laughing genuinely for what felt like the first time in over a year. Arthur stopped by occasionally too, sometimes just to check in, sometimes with updates from the new board, and I came to appreciate, more than I expected, having a neighbor whose quiet steadiness felt like the exact opposite of everything Regina Voss had spent 11 years pretending to be. The State Real Estate Commission's final report on Chester Doyle's falsified surveys, released publicly the following year, confirmed formally what Marisol had suspected from the beginning, a pattern, stretching across 3 separate counties, not just Millbrook Ridge, suggesting Regina's scheme had been one repeated instance of something far larger and more troubling than anyone initially realized. That final report prompted 2 other families in neighboring subdivisions to reach out to Marisol directly, having recognized their own boundary disputes in the news coverage of our case. Quietly grateful that someone had finally pushed hard enough to expose a pattern they'd assumed, for years, was simply their own bad luck. I spoke with one of those families myself, over coffee, sharing what little guidance I could offer about records requests, expired leases, and the particular exhausting patience required to fight a fraud built slowly enough that most people simply stopped believing their own eyes long before anyone else did. Walt passed away peacefully the following winter, and at his small funeral, held at the same community garden where Denise's gathering had once marked Regina's downfall, more than half of Cedar Hollow estates turned out, remembering him not for 30 quiet years of maintenance work, but for the one moment he'd finally spoken up. Arthur spoke at that funeral, mentioning Walt's testimony specifically as the turning point that had given the rest of the neighborhood the courage to finally say, out loud, things they'd quietly known for years, and I found myself grateful, watching the crowd, that his courage had been properly honored while people could still tell him so. I inherited, in a strange final twist neither Marisol nor I had anticipated, a modest bequest from Walt's own estate, his old toolbox, a handwritten note, thanking me for finally finishing what your daddy started, and a small key to a storage unit containing decades of his own private, handwritten maintenance logs. Those logs, turned out, documented years of small, quiet observations about Cedar Hollow Commons construction irregularities that Walt had simply never known where to send. Evidence Sergeant Ruiz later confirmed corroborated the State Commission's broader findings about Chester Doyle's pattern across multiple counties entirely. I donated copies of those logs to the State Commission's ongoing broader investigation, understanding that Walt, in his quiet, unassuming way, had been documenting the truth for years, waiting patiently for someone, anyone, to finally care enough to ask him the right questions before he ran out of time to answer them. The garden near the old barn site grew steadily over that first full year. Sunflowers eventually taller than the fence line itself. And I found myself sitting out there most evenings, coffee in hand, watching the 12 beige buildings in the distance. No longer symbols of loss but simply buildings now. Ordinary and unremarkable. I hired a small local property management firm to handle the day-to-day operations of the Cedar Hollow Commons ownership stake, choosing deliberately to keep my own involvement light, unwilling to let this land define the rest of my life the way it had, understandably, consumed my father's final years. The Reyes Family Trust's first annual disbursement from the commercial properties arrived that spring, a modest but meaningful sum that I used, in part, to fund a small scholarship in my father's name at the local community college. Something Priya helped set up through the historical society he'd once volunteered for. I thought often, that year, about the strange shape justice sometimes takes. Not dramatic, not immediate, but slow and procedural and built from unsent letters, expired leases, sworn confessions, and one quiet maintenance man finally deciding 30 years of silence was long enough for anybody to carry alone. Regina Voss, I heard eventually, through channels I no longer actively sought out, had taken a modest administrative job in a town 2 counties over, unrecognized, presumably, by neighbors who had no idea the woman filing their permits had once ruled an entire subdivision through fear and a falsified boundary line. I felt, hearing that, less satisfaction than I expected to, Mostly just a quiet closing of something that had occupied nearly 2 years of my life. Grief and fraud and fear tangled together so thoroughly that separating them now felt almost impossible. And perhaps, I decided, unnecessary anyway. The formal criminal case against Regina Voss closed permanently that autumn. Restitution fully paid. Probation nearly complete. Her name quietly added to a state registry barring future HOA leadership roles. A small, procedural, unglamorous ending to a scheme that had once felt, from inside it, utterly unstoppable. Cedar Hollow Estates held its first fully transparent annual meeting that year under Arthur's leadership. Public votes recorded. Financial disclosures printed and distributed to every household. And I sat in the audience simply as a neighbor now. No longer the woman fighting a fraud. Just Callie, from the old Reyes place. Denise ran successfully for a seat on the newly reconstituted audit committee herself that year, joking that her old parking fines had accidentally turned her into the neighborhood's most vigilant financial watchdog. A transformation neither of us could have predicted the day she first warned me. Nervously, over the fence, I stood at my father's grave again that autumn. A full turn of seasons since I'd first told him about the unsent letter, and told him this time that the buildings were still standing, that they'd simply stopped being a wound, that they'd become, slowly, something closer to an unlikely inheritance. The sunflowers by the old barn site bloomed one final time before the first frost, and I cut a small bundle to bring to Walt's grave, setting them beside a modest headstone that read only his name and dates, understanding that some of the most important witnesses in any story never ask for more than that. Marisol called one last time that winter, mostly just to check in, mentioning that the Cedar Hollow case had quietly become something of a model referenced in state training materials about HOA financial oversight, a legacy neither of us had set out to create, but one that felt, in its own procedural way, worth having built. I sold none of the Cedar Hollow Commons stake in the end, choosing instead to let the Reyes family trust hold it fully, generating modest steady income for whatever came next in my life. A strange, unplanned inheritance built entirely from 12 buildings someone once constructed specifically to erase my family's name. Life in Millbrook Ridge settled, slowly, into something quieter and more honest than it had been in over a decade. Homeowners speaking openly at meetings, board decisions made in daylight, and a modest sunflower garden growing steadily where an old barn and an old fight had both once stood. Denise still brings casseroles occasionally, unprompted, and Arthur still stops by sometimes just to talk. And the bakery still sells its boundary line bun. A strange, sweet little monument to the year an entire neighborhood learned exactly how much truth a single falsified survey line had managed to hide. I think, sometimes, about how close my father came to winning this quietly, alone, back in 2009, and how differently things might have gone if grief and illness hadn't stopped him before he finished the fight. And I try, mostly successfully now, to let that thought bring gratitude rather than regret. The garden keeps growing every year, a little wider, a little wilder, right where the old barn stood, right where 12 commercial buildings sit in the distance, quietly generating income for the family they were originally built to erase. Proof that patience, eventually, outlasts even the most carefully constructed lie. Regina Voss's name still appears occasionally in state HOA training materials as a cautionary example. An ending she likely never imagined for herself back when she first signed a grazing lease with my grandfather in 1998. Young and confident, decades before any of this ever came to pass. I still keep my father's unsent letter in that office drawer, folded carefully, a reminder that some fights outlive the people who start them, and that finishing what someone else began isn't defeat or obligation, but simply, sometimes, the quietest and truest form love ever manages to take. Cedar Hollow Estates moves on now. Ordinary and unremarkable, the way any healthy neighborhood should. Its 12 buildings standing steady in the Georgia sun. Its sunflowers blooming every autumn over ground that finally, after nearly 30 years, belongs exactly to the family whose name was on the deed all along.